How do you change that mindset when you have destroyed the homes of so many people?
No one in 1944 said, if you keep bombing Nazi Germany, you're going to breed a new generation of Nazis. No, people understood, here is an evil, evil regime that must be destroyed, and then there must be de-radicalization in order to take a different path forward. And Germany and Japan are now powerful, prosperous democracies and Western allies. And if it can be done with Nazi Germany, then I still have hope for Hamas Gaza.
This is a Visegrad 24 series about the Israel-Hamas war.
My name is Stefan Tompson, and I'm here with another Visegrad 24 podcast filmed on the ground in Israel. We're here meeting with Israelis, we're meeting with the Jewish diaspora, we're meeting with politicians, influencers, journalists, experts. We're meeting with a range of Israeli society to get an understanding of what is happening here, to give you the truth unfiltered as it is. And I'm here with Eylon Levy, the spokesman of the Israeli government, someone who has become one of the faces of this conflict, someone who's certainly become one of the faces of Israel, and someone who is one of the most well-known advocates for the Israeli cause. Eylon, good to have you.
It's good to be here. Being a face of a conflict is not what I dreamed of being when I was growing up, but here we are.
What did you dream of being when you were growing up?
I wanted to write musicals. And here I am now being the face of Israel in the war that we are fighting against Hamas, that has been dragging on now. But we know as a country, and I've never seen Israel so united, understanding that we have a mission that we have to complete now, to bring the hostages home and to bring the Hamas rapist regime to justice.
Why should the world care about Israel?
First of all, I'm not sure that the world should care as much as it does at the moment. Israel plays an outsized role in global imagination, far out of proportion to the real geopolitical ramifications, the people on the ground compared to other conflicts around the world. It has this unhealthy grip on the global imagination. And you can't disconnect it from the history of anti-Semitism and the history of the role that Jewish people have always played in the Western mindset, that have always been held up as a mirror against which societies have defined themselves. If they're nationalist, the Jews are cosmopolitan. If they're cosmopolitan, the Jews are nationalist. If they're communist, the Jews are capitalist, communist. It's always been the mirror against which they define themselves. And so we find ourselves with other countries where Israel fits into their culture wars. And they end up projecting their fantasies and their own neuroses and stories onto us, even when it's not really about us. That's why in the United States, which has its own very painful legacy of racial oppression, they understand our conflict through the lens of race. And the British will view it through the lens of imperialism. And the Irish understand it through the lens of Catholics versus Protestants. And I'm told that in Malaysia, the hostility to Israel has something to do with their own het-ups about Chinese migrants. But that's the story that Israel has always played in people's minds, helping societies define themselves. You know, there's a fascinating book by David Nirenberg called Anti-Judaism. And it describes a 300-year period in Western Europe when there are no Jews there because they've been kicked out. And people are still accusing each other of being Jews and being Judaizers because there is something about Jews and now Israel as the Jewish state that has this grip on people's imagination, even in a way that isn't directly connected to reality.
You said something that you believe that in the imagination, this collective imagination, Israel plays an outsized role to its actual geopolitical ramifications. Are you sure about that?
Outsized role, yes, but the geopolitical ramifications are absolutely present and important. We are, in this war especially, fighting for humanity on the front lines of humanity, and it's important to understand the stakes of what is happening here. On October 7th, Israel came under a barbaric assault, not just by Hamas as a branch of the Palestinian nationalist movement, but by Hamas as a proxy of Iran. The same Iran that is funding the Houthi pirates that are now attacking international shipping, the same Iran that propped up the Assad regime and has parasitically taken over Lebanon. Now, Iran has an imperial project to take over the Middle East, to sow its influence across the region, and it's done that through an unholy alliance together with the Muslim Brotherhood and radical elements of Sunni Islam as well. Now, Israel at the moment is the most powerful, maybe the only bulwark against Iranian influence and Iranian aggression in the Middle East. Iran wants to knock Israel out of action, whether by assaulting us on all fronts from the south and the north at the same time, or getting a nuclear umbrella that will make it impossible for Israel to defend itself so that it can knock Israel out of action and then know that there is nothing stopping it from taking over the whole Middle East. And once Iran is able to replicate its old imperial fantasies of taking over the whole Middle East, it would then find itself, right, pushing up against the borders of Western civilization itself. And we hope that people understand, therefore, that Israel's fight is not only our fight against the Palestinian national movement that sees no room for the Jewish people to live at all in the land of Israel, but part of a much broader civilizational struggle against the forces that are trying to sow instability and chaos in order to export their own revolution and violent version of religion and impose that on a region that is moving in a direction of peace and prosperity and normalization and has a lot of very good things going for it.
I wanted to ask you about an uncomfortable question about your war with Hamas, because ultimately we are talking about a fairly weak organization that is, it's well funded obviously, but it doesn't have a conventional army, it doesn't have nuclear weapons, it doesn't have any tanks, and the images that come out of Gaza of Gaza being flattened. I mean, it almost looks like it's being flattened building by building. Once you do defeat Hamas, once you've gone house by house and you've found every Hamas militant and every terrorist, and what happens to the civilian population of Gaza? Where do they go back home?
You're right that there are images of widespread destruction coming out of Gaza. Now, they remind me a lot of the scenes of Raqqa and Mosul after the West was done rooting out ISIS. Now, I don't think it's fair to say you're not fighting an army. It's true that Hamas doesn't have nuclear weapons, thank God, and doesn't have tanks, thank God. But this isn't a ragtaggle bunch of terrorists fighting an insurgency. They have organized themselves as a military with battalions, with brigades, with a military structure. And is that army that we are fighting and we are destroying. Now, I don't think people understand what the Hamas human shield strategy is all about. They don't understand that Hamas has spent the last 16 years redesigning Gaza's cityscape in order to hide their military assets underground using civilian infrastructure above ground. There's a Gaza above ground and below ground, and the Gaza below ground is a whole tunnel network that reportedly spans for 350 to 450 miles, which is astonishing for a territory that is only 25 miles across at the widest. The London Underground is 250 miles, and we're talking about the Hamas metro being 350, 400. Now, of the 1,500 tunnel shafts that we have located so far, the overwhelming majority are inside schools, hospitals, kindergartens, mosques, and even private homes. Our soldiers pushed away children's beds and found tunnel shafts poking underneath. Now, Hamas did this because it knows that one of three things will happen. Either by hiding under civilians, they render their military facilities immune from attack. And then they win because Israel can't attack them and they can keep fighting. They can just retreat behind civilians and keep shooting. Or Israel will attack and civilians will be killed. And that is a victory for Hamas as well, which says we want to martyr them, we want to sacrifice them. It looks great on CNN as far as they're concerned. It's awful, but this is their sick ideology. Or Israel asks civilians to evacuate temporarily for their safety, and then the UN will condemn Israel for forcibly displacing Palestinians by doing what we are supposed to do under the international laws of armed conflict, by urging civilians to get out of a war zone where their leaders are trying to use them as human shields. So the devastation that we are seeing in Gaza is a consequence of Hamas having deliberately redesigned Gaza's whole urban planning to try to shield their military infrastructure, and to get to that military infrastructure, we need civilians to get out of harm's way. Now, we hope that the day after Hamas, it will be possible to rebuild Gaza in a way that ensures that the concrete genuinely goes to people's houses and not to the tunnels that are connected to those houses. Because I visited one of the Hamas terror tunnels. It stretches for 4 kilometers into the Gaza Strip. You're a London boy as well. It's like the stretch of the Northern Line from Camden Town to Waterloo. It's the width of a tube train. It's insane how much concrete they poured into this military project underground. But look, for this to happen, it's not enough just to get rid of Hamas. The Palestinians have to get rid of the mindset of Hamas as well. They have to understand that terrorism is a dead end.
But do
that
you
has
not
brought
think
them nothing but misery, and that there is no light at the end of that tunnel. They have to course correct, because if they try to hunker down on the same failed strategies of the past, if they don't learn their lessons from repeated disaster after disaster, every time they try to destroy Israel, and it doesn't work and there's a backlash, then we will find ourselves in another cycle of violence. That's why we're calling for de-radicalization.
But how do you change that mindset when you have destroyed the homes of so many people? I understand that the civilian population, I've seen the statistics. I am aware that the Palestinian population overwhelmingly supports Hamas. They voted them in, they kept them in the power, they didn't overthrow them.
So interestingly, to the extent they don't support Hamas, it's because it's done a bloody bad job of governing Gaza. But it's the point of violent struggle against Israel that does win it points, because on that point it is popular. And that's why its popularity is surging in the West Bank, where 82% say it was right to conduct these attacks.
How will you change that mindset? Is this even, how will you, I mean, essentially saying, hey, we want to rebuild Gaza once we finish dealing with Hamas, but the population hasn't changed its mind, so you're now in a vicious circle, right?
The Prime Minister has laid out his 3D vision for peace. For there to be peace between Israel and Gaza, here are 3 prerequisites. You need all 3 of them. Destroy Hamas. We'll do that by ourselves.
Okay.
Demilitarize Gaza. On us. De-radicalize Palestinian society. That is going to require the involvement of the international community. Now, it can be done, okay? No one in 1944 said, if you keep bombing Nazi Germany, you're going to breed a new generation of Nazis, okay? If you keep bombing Germany, that will only fuel extremism. Yeah. No, people understood, here is an evil, evil regime that must be destroyed, and then there must be de-radicalization in order to take a different path forward. And Germany and Japan are now powerful, prosperous democracies and Western allies. And if it can be done with Nazi Germany, then I still have hope for Hamas Gaza. But it will require the international community to understand the incredible damage that they have done by trying to be well-meaning humanitarians in fueling this conflict with Gaza. One example, the refugee issue. I don't know whether people realize that there are 2 refugee agencies in the world. One for the Palestinians and one for everyone else. Now, if you, God forbid, Stefan, were to find yourself a refugee, the moment you find permanent residency or citizenship somewhere else, that's it. You're no longer a refugee. Not so with the Palestinians. They hand down refugee status down the generations, patrilineally. Even if you have citizenship, even if you have residency, even if you are, as far as you're concerned, a Palestinian living under a Palestinian government in Palestine, 70% of the people in the Gaza Strip are classified as being refugees, even though they were displaced from nowhere other than their mother's wombs. And what happens then when the UN tells them, Gaza isn't your home, you don't really belong in Gaza. Somewhere over the rainbow, you have a right to resettle in Israel, you have a right to wage a violent struggle to go there. Don't bother rebuilding in Gaza because you're not going to stay here for long. That's why the so-called refugee camps have always been breeding grounds for terrorists. All the terrorists of the Munich massacre, products of the refugee camps. And we need the world to tell the Palestinians some tough truths. 1948 is over. Israel is here for good, to exist. And your best hope of peace and prosperity is to live next to Israel and work with it rather than trying to destroy it. And we can't allow another generation to be brought up on a diet of jihad and indoctrination and martyrdom. I don't think people understand when people in the West talk of universal values. Sure. Not everyone in the universe shares your universal values. Some people have a very different ideology that prioritizes very different values from your own. And they need to understand the extent of the destruction to which this from the river to the sea ideology that makes no space for the state of Israel whatsoever, the disaster that has led the Palestinians into time and time again. And it's not too late to course correct and to have genuinely peaceful relations between peaceful neighbors.
What do you think are some of the lessons that the West could learn from Israel?
I have been astonished since the October 7 massacre to see just how resilient this country is. It was a country that didn't give itself any time to wallow in shock because people immediately jumped into action, grabbing what weapons they had to defend the kibbutzim, immediately collection drives to get socks for all the soldiers on the front and to cook food. Civil society mobilized. It came together and it bounced back. And if in Israel, if God forbid in the West you have a terror attack at a cafe, it's a crime scene for a month. In Israel, it will be open the following day because Israelis, being Israeli is about trying to find normality in the most abnormal circumstances. These are people who have Rachel Goldberg, the mother of one of the hostages in Gaza. His arm was blown off from the elbow down when Hamas threw grenades into a rocket shelter. He was abducted with an amputated arm that was blown off. She tells me, I said, how do you keep strong? She says, when you're going through hell, keep walking. And that's the Israeli mindset. And people here are incredibly resilient and have a fantastic way in times of emergency of working together. And by the way, I think that's part of the reason why, despite all the terror attacks and the wars, polls consistently show Israelis to be among the happiest people in the world. And it's because we have strong community ties of family, strong relationships, a strong sense of being in it together, a strong sense of collective purpose. And these are the things that give people meaning and make people get up in the morning and say, we're going to keep fighting because we have something to live for. And Israelis know what they live for.
You've just come back from the UK where you gave a speech at Trafalgar Square. You were at a pro-Israeli protest. But I know you grew up in the UK, you went to school and university in the UK. How do you feel when you see the large-scale demonstrations, anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and some pretty shocking slogans on posters, and some pretty shocking slogans? I mean, I'm not even talking about from the river to the sea.
Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around. I mean, these are people on the streets of London calling for violent attacks against British forces and British targets. These are not pro-Palestinian protests. These are pro-Hamas protests, okay? These are hate parades. They were pro-Palestinian protests, and they genuinely, sincerely cared about civilians. They would say, Hamas has brought disaster on the Palestinian people with its psychopathic decision to launch the bloodiest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and take hostages. What did they expect was happening? Release the hostages, lay down your arms, hand over your pedophile rapists for a war crimes tribunal, and this war will be over. But they don't do that. They call for a ceasefire now, and ceasefire now means, with Hamas still holding onto the hostages, it's torturing and raping in its terror dungeons, and with Hamas free to reoffend when it tells us it wants to do this again and again. So don't tell me you're not pro-Hamas when you say that you want this conflict to end with Hamas getting away with this. And it is horrifying, and we think that the world needs to understand the extent of the domestic extremism problem that has built up. The total not just demonization of Israel, dehumanization of Jews and Israelis. People put up posters of the hostages, they get ripped down. How far do you need to have dehumanized a 2-year-old Israeli baby to rip down a poster of a kidnapped child? And I know, speaking to members of the Jewish community, they are traumatized to discover that many of their neighbors, who they thought were perfectly normal people, are in fact perfectly happy tearing down posters of kidnapped babies. Now, the UK wants Israel to win this war. Rishi Sunak said that immediately after the war. Sure. The Deputy Prime Minister recently said, we must eradicate Hamas. The problem is there is this large movement now that is trying to put domestic pressure on the UK government, not to pursue its own foreign policy interests, not to pursue its own national security interests. Now, that's a problem for us, but it's a problem for the UK as well, which knows this war has to end with the end of Hamas, because otherwise it gives a big boost to violent extremists around the world. And now when we see people on the streets of London chanting for Houthi pirate terror attacks against British forces, it is clear that what began with Israel hasn't ended with Israel. It has metastasized into a much broader support for Islamist violence against the West. And they need to be very serious about treating that seriously, cracking down on it, and understanding the threat that that poses to their pursuit of their own foreign policy and national security interests.
Hamas is just the start of your problems, really.
Yeah.
What are the next steps? How do you see this play out in the next sort of coming months, coming years?
Best case scenario is Hamas surrenders, its fighting forces are collapsing, they face the increasing wrath of the Palestinian people who are turning on Hamas. That front crumbles. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is forced to withdraw from the northern border in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and the 80,000 Israelis who have been displaced because their homes are being shelled can return to their homes with no fear of a repeat October 7th. Because that is the threat, as long as Hezbollah is on the northern border, and we understand we can't take that risk, okay? Anyone who is abducted into Lebanon by Hezbollah is in Iran by the afternoon. We have no room for error. That's the best case scenario. But it takes two to tango, and we are warning Hezbollah now, back off or be pushed away. We cannot tolerate the ongoing displacement of 80,000 Israelis from their homes. Israeli territory will not be a buffer against a terror organization that might abduct and rape and massacre people. You need to back off. And if Hezbollah does not do that and does not comply with the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which Israel agrees to, which the government of Lebanon agrees to, which the UN Secretary General has called to be implemented, there is a risk of a very serious escalation in the north, because Hezbollah will have decided to join a full-scale war on the side of Hamas, a totally unnecessary war that the people of Lebanon don't need, that we don't need, that can still be avoided. And if we are talking about a full-scale war with this army of terror that has 150,000 rockets and no qualms, no sense of morality or humanity, the consequences can be severe in a regional escalation that we are now trying to avert and hope that it is still possible by diplomatic means to restore security in accordance with international law and the relevant UN Security Council resolutions.
There have been hundreds of UN resolutions over the last decade or two against Israel. Why does Israel stay in the United Nations?
Because the whole point of Zionism, the national movement of the Jewish people, is for us to reclaim our rightful place in the family of nations. Israel is not a...
Even if it's in an organization that spends most of its time, I think it's about 40% of all UN resolutions passed against Israel, even if that family of nations spends half of its efforts sort of attacking and shitting all over you.
I think it was Lyndon B. Johnson who said it's always better to be inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent. So it's better to be than outside the tent getting pissed on, right? To paraphrase Lyndon B. Johnson. The UN is a deeply problematic organization. I know many people in the West still treat it with reverence instead of understanding. This is a club of states. At best, 80 states can be classified as free. Most of them are not free. Most of them are not democratic. And as a result, the institutions of the UN reflect the priorities and interests of deeply repressive societies as well that have weaponized these institutions against Israel and against the free world. It's a deeply problematic institution, but we did not reclaim our sovereignty in our ancient homeland in order to be a fortress nation cut off from the rest of the world. We did so in order to reclaim our rightful place among the family of nations. We know that we have friends and allies. It is sometimes difficult for them to stand up for us because there is a campaign of violent intimidation that is trying to make it impossible to publicly identify with Israel. It's part of the same pincer movement that Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood are trying to do, to press on Israel militarily while applying pressure from within Western societies to leave Israel exposed and defenseless. But we're fighting. We're fighting both militarily and diplomatically as well, strengthening our diplomatic alliances and friendships so that we can convince our friends and allies that we're doing exactly what they would do if they came under such a barbaric assault, or rather what they would like to think that they would be capable of doing if they came under such barbaric assault, to bring their children home safe and protect them from terrorist monsters, psychopaths who want to do this again.
I mean, I know that if my daughter was kidnapped by terrorists, I would go house to house.
Yeah, you would go.
Absolutely,
you would go to the
100%.
ends of the earth. And I'm horrified by the apathy of people around the world who are saying, okay, Israelis, enough is enough. You've had your fun. Maybe let's call it quits. No, we're not going to call it quits. Because if your children were abducted by rapists who you fear are raping them in their terror dungeons, you will not stop and you will not rest until they are home and until their tormentors are brought to justice.
My final question is, what's next for Eylon Levy?
I get a lot of questions about what happens the day after, and my answer is I don't know how old I'm going to be the day after because I told you that range of scenarios. We don't know whether this war is going to end with Hamas surrendering and Hezbollah retreating in a week, or whether we're in it for the long haul. we're in a very serious fight. A lot of tectonic plates have been shifting and have brought us up to this moment. We hope as a society to get out of this and to get out of it in a way that we are stronger as a society and able to rebuild this country. And I hope that however this country tries to heal afterwards, I'll have some role in helping defend it and articulate it and put everything that we've been doing in this war to service after the war. But first we have a war to win. We have Hamas to destroy. We have the hostages to bring back home.
And how are you feeling, just generally?
You know, it's been a sprint till now, and we're adjusting into treating it as a marathon. We understand this isn't going to be over anytime soon, and we're trying to pace ourselves because it is exhausting to wake up every morning and essentially wage war on the world, because you are fighting not only against Hamas, you are fighting also against the UN agencies that are covering up for Hamas, the human rights organizations that are then covering up for the fact that they're covering up for Hamas, and trying to convince the world of what is so obviously and patently true to everyone in Israel who are, you know, scratching their heads and tearing their hair out about how the rest of the world doesn't see it. And that's our job, to shine light so that other people can see and so they can't look away.
Eylon Levy, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.